Well, it goes back to initiative and a gut decision. It's always the road not taken. What is going to be the best option? Those that came here as migrants, because I think in the debate we need to separate those who want to immigrate or intend to immigrate and those who are just coming here for work. Those who have the money saved and see an opportunity to go back home probably will make that decision. And then there's the ambivalency of opportunity. I think in the economic realm, outside the emotional discussion, at the end, the U.S. has a deficit of workers. The population is not growing fast enough with the normal growth of the economy. There's always going to be a need for workers, be it permanent or temporary, in the U.S. And again, the neighborhood families, those who imported their families as children but are now 15, 20 years old, are not going to want to go back to a place they no longer recognize, even though they were born there. And that's going to weigh on the parents' decision whether to move or not.
Time. That's an important part of this conversation, isn't it? I mean, if you go someplace thinking it's temporary, after a while, you do feel at home in the place you go to and less at home in the place you came from.
That's right. I mean, that's a natural reaction. But, as long as there are disparities between our economy and the Latin American economies, people are still going to come. I remember as a young visa officer in the Dominican Republic many years ago, finding an economist who had a teaching job in the Dominican Republic, who stayed illegally in the U.S. to mop floors and clean toilets. And I asked him when he was deported, why did he do that? Why did you take that tremendous risk? And he said, I can make 3 times as much mopping floors in the U.S. than teaching. And as long as you have those kind of incentives, people are still going to come.
And I think that is one of the key issues that needs to be addressed, which Marc had brought up earlier, looking at the development issue and the migration and development. There's actually the Global Forum on Migration and Development has been hosted by the Mexican government this coming November, which is an international forum to really talk about between how do you take advantage of the economic contribution of migrants in the countries where they end up living to their contribution at home, but also I think the big issue of how do you create the conditions in these countries of origin so that people don't have to make that decision of do I want to migrate or not, or it's made based on I want to stay in my home country or I want to go to the United States or elsewhere to join my family, but that it's more of a decision based not necessarily just on economic need.
But how good is good enough? If you say, well, once we get conditions back in the sending countries, something more comparable to the United States, then people will stay home. But really, in some countries, that's never. Right. Or maybe a long, long time from now, quite frankly. And talk about that.
Well, I mean, when you look historically, when you look at 19th century and early 20th century migration, you do see sort of an inverted U-shaped pattern where you had, a peak migration and the migration, the shrinking of the labor force in the country of origin and the remittances that come back contribute to a narrowing of the wage gap between the sending and receiving countries. So we will, we expect that we will see some of that dynamic over time. But you're right. I mean, we're not, in the near future, going to erase the wage gap between the U.S. and Mexico. But another factor that definitely plays into the long-term conversation are demographics in Mexico and the U.S. And Mexico, for many years, had a very high fertility rate and many more people entering the workforce than it could generate jobs for. And that fertility rate has really fallen dramatically in the last couple of decades. So that the demographic bulge in Mexico is we're past the point where there's many more people entering the workforce than the economy can absorb, although there's still a few more. And it's complemented by demographics in the U.S. that Colonel Rojo was talking about, where we have a lot of demand for young workers in this country with our aging workforce. But when you look at comparative cases, when you look, for example, at what happened in the EU, there's still a big wealth gap between Southern and Northern Europe, and you don't see dramatic migration in an open immigration regime at a 4-to-1 wage gap rather than like a 10-to-1 wage gap that we have here. So you don't have to imagine that the U.S. and Mexico will have no wage gap, but with demographics favoring less migration and with, if the wage gap were to narrow, to something like a 4-to-1 instead of a 10-to-1, then we would see reduced immigration pressure.
In one context or another, several of you have mentioned development and the increase in productive capacity back in the sending countries. And they've all used that as a strategy. We're going to enter the global marketplace doing this. And because we can do it at a fairly low cost, we'll be competitive. But isn't there a point where you get to a kind of ambient overcapacity, where everyone can make cotton undershirts, for instance? And there, if you go into a discount store in the United States and look in the collars of cotton undershirts, they're made all through Latin America. Well, if everybody's making them, at some point there's just more cotton undershirts than there are torsos to put them on. And not everybody's going to want to buy them, and an export-led economic strategy is not going to be the answer to some of these countries' problems.
It's not the only answer, I think, but I do think that helps. I do think the key is education. Primary education is not valued as much as it should be in many Latin American countries. A lot of the resources going to universities, and the primary education is neglected. And if you look at the Asian tigers, for example, and compare them to some, for example, Central American countries, the difference was in the Asian countries, education was a government priority. And it isn't in many of the Latin American countries. And
So if you look at South Korea and Singapore,
for example,
40 years ago,
Taiwan,
they had very similar incomes to Latin American
Exactly.
countries, and now there's a tremendous gap. Maureen?
I think, obviously, I agree in terms of education as being important, and other types of social investment, healthcare, et cetera. I do think, though, looking at the economic model itself, even with the Asian tigers or Brazil, for example, the way they've gone about opening up their economies has been different, with more controls than what Mexico and now Central America have kind of entered into through NAFTA and CAFTA, these agreements with the United States. I think Mexico's case, they lost about 2 million jobs in the agricultural sector with the opening of NAFTA. And I think part of it is in terms of competition with U.S. products, but also a failure to invest in small-scale and medium-scale agriculture in Mexico. And the other is investment. If you look at, depending, as you said, on producing shirts and cheap labor, the way that these agreements are enforced is now Mexico can't have national content in a lot of their products. The wages are still very low. How do you ensure that you can actually have better technological transfers to these countries and support even small and medium-scale businesses, which have certainly been affected by the agreement, so that you actually can create a national economy with more consumers in your countries instead of just relying on exports?
Well, it may also be a temporary window where that is successful until the world finds somebody who can do it even cheaper. Mm-hmm. I was in a famous discount store. Can I say? Filene's? I was in Filene's. And looking at men's clothing, and saw for the first time made in Lesotho. Now, Lesotho is probably a country that won't even be recognized by most Filene's customers, but it's one of the poorest places on planet Earth. The wage scales undercut Central American wage scales by probably 75–80%. Places like Lesotho become the flavor of the month, and a Honduran simply can't compete except by being even poorer, which is probably not what they had in mind. Go ahead.
Yeah, I mean, part of the problem, as you were suggesting earlier, I mean, in general, the world is capital poor and labor rich. There's a lot of workers, and the low wage model of production can always be undercut. I mean, so that's not, Mexico's long-term solution is not low wage production for exactly the reason that you're suggesting. It has to be moving up the production scale and upskilling its workforce and being part of a competitive region with the U.S. and in the same way that U.S. manufacturing was outsourced, Mexican manufacturing has been outsourced in the NAFTA period.